On the morning of March 14th, 2015, in Studio City, a quaint neighborhood in Hollywood, California, 911 operators received a call from a woman who feared her friend was having a stroke. When paramedics entered the residence, they found a half-naked woman lying on the floor in a back bedroom. She was wearing a shirt, but wore nothing below the waist. The woman was delirious and had trouble communicating, but there was no sign there was anything seriously wrong with her. There was no obvious reason why she hadn't called 911 herself. Then paramedics sensed that she wasn't there, alone. Dog bowls and dog toys were laid all around the house. When they asked the woman about the dogs, she said she had 3, and that they may be in the garage, along with her younger sister. What initially seemed to be a tragic accident would unravel a murder mystery so bizarre that it could have been written in Hollywood. And it may have been. Who was this victim dead in the garage, and who was the monster who trapped her and her 3 dogs inside? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss tales of murder around the world and throughout history, discussing its many layers, hoping to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. I would just like to take a moment and thank you to all who listen and support my show. If you have not done so, please make sure that you are followed on your platform of choice and consider leaving a 5-star rating or a review so that other people can find the show. Thank you. While one paramedic stayed with the woman inside the house checking her vitals, the other entered a detached garage next to the house in the 12,000 block of Landale Street. It was completely dark inside, and his eyes immediately burned. He opened the garage door and saw a woman lying on her side on top of a pile of blankets. Emergency personnel tried their best to resuscitate the woman, but tragically, she was already dead. She was identified as 48-year-old Wendy Blackstone. One of her dogs was lying behind her, who sadly was also deceased. On the ground was a charcoal grill, still smoldering, and beside it sat a metal trash can with ash burning inside. Combined, it was determined that they had released carbon monoxide poisoning, filling up the garage with toxins, killing Wendy Blackstone and her dog. The 2 other dogs were quickly pulled out of the garage. They were both suffering from severe carbon monoxide poisoning. Paramedics called the police right away, while first responders attended to Jill. Animal Red, a rescue organization, was called in to tend to the 2 surviving dogs. Detectives arrived at the scene within minutes. An officer observed how one of the dogs had a burn on his nose that was in the same shape as the grill. The brave dog had knocked it over in an attempt to put out the fire. While Jill Blackstone was being laid on a gurney to be taken to the hospital, her friend Tracy Reese arrived, who officers soon realized was the person who had called 911. Although Wendy Blackstone was already deceased when paramedics arrived, the circumstances around her death were strange and suspicious. At first appearance, it looked like there was a possibility of it being a suicide or even a tragic accident, but that belief quickly shifted. Investigators noticed signs that were placed outside the garage. Secured with black duct tape on a black trash can were very bizarre notes. They gave instructions on where to find the 2 women and the 3 dogs. The first sign read, and I quote, "Enter carefully. There is a garage door opener on the wall to the left of the side door mounted on the wall. Both parties have do not resuscitate orders. Can be found in binder inside. 2 keys to Lexus and the remote control for the driveway gate are inside." At the bottom of this sign were 2 sticky notes that said Jill Blackstone /brown hair and Wendy Blackstone /red hair to help identify their bodies. The second note stated that the gas valves were turned off inside the house and the garage. A third note read, "Please do not call animal services for my dogs. Call one of the following to make arrangements for dogs pickup and cremations with 2 different options to contact. Collars and tags go to Tracy, ashes to be turned to Dr. Tracy. My estate will pay the bill for their cremations. They do have Trupanion pet insurance, which covers cremation if someone can submit the claim. The policy numbers for their 3 rescue dogs, Bentley, Bruce, and Izzy, were listed. The Blackstone sisters had co-founded and ran together Thumping Tails Animal Rescue Center from their home in Studio City. How could anyone who loves animals that much willingly kill them? Even if you wanted to end your own life, it would take a horribly selfish and disturbed person to think that they should take their dogs along with them. Nothing about this scenario made sense. You may be willing to die for them, even kill for them, given certain circumstances, but never would a loving pet parent murder them. Now, maybe under the most extreme of health circumstances, where your animal is suffering far too much to live a decent existence any longer, then you may take them to a vet and put them to sleep. This was not the case. The dogs were all healthy and happy, and except for her known disabilities, it was believed that the human victim, Wendy Blackstone, was also. Inside the garage close to the victim's hand was a suicide note that read, and I quote, "Under no circumstances do I wish to be resuscitated or kept on life support. My sister, Wendy Blackstone, shares those same wishes." The binder mentioned in the note on the trash can outside the garage was found on Jill Blackstone's desk. It was labeled Last Will and Testament for Jill and Wendy. Keys to the Lexus and passwords for their computers were found inside. There was a very unsettling note on the binder that said, "Wendy is loved. Know that." Now, for what reason would there have been for Jill to have written that about her sister? This note was strange and greatly raised the suspicions of law enforcement. They also noticed that there were no signatures of Wendy Blackstone's on the Do Not Resuscitate orders, nor on any of the other notes or signs. Everything appeared to be written by Jill Blackstone. The more they analyzed the crime scene, the more perplexing and troubling it became. Was it possible that it was a double suicide that went terribly wrong, leaving one sister dead and the other still alive? It was all very convoluted and confusing until police spoke with a woman who made the 911 call. It was learned that an officer at the crime scene overheard Tracy Reese ask Jill Blackstone before she was placed in the ambulance, "Did you do this on purpose?" To which Jill flatly replied, "No." That seemed like a huge red flag to detectives, so they needed to talk to Tracy Reese promptly. They brought her in for an official interview that same day. One police officer questioned her as to why she would ask Jill this question. She said that she knew Jill was tired of taking care of Wendy. Jill had expressed how she hoped Wendy would move back to the East Coast to live with her family so she could move on with her own life. But that never happened, so Tracy thought, well, maybe Jill decided to do something about it. This was a huge break in the case. It was obvious that Jill was good friends with Tracy since she was the one person she chose to call when she desperately needed help. Jill didn't call the police or anyone else in her life, only Tracy. Now, here was her closest friend and confidant, who had just admitted to police that she thought Jill was capable of harming her sister. Tracy initially also left out the fact that Jill had told her on the phone that her sister and the dogs were dead in the garage. She told police that there was nothing but silence in the background, and so she asked Jill where Wendy and the dogs were. Jill simply said, "I think they're dead in the garage." Who knows when Jill would have ever called the police? It was her friend, not her, who called the police because she knew that Wendy and the dogs needed help. Police found it weird and concerning that Tracy had omitted this information when she first called 911. When asked point blank if she thought Jill had tried to kill her sister Wendy, she said she never would have killed her sister and the dogs. However, she couldn't take back the fact that she had questioned Jill about it at the scene. which led police to believe that Tracy thought she was capable of murder. When investigators interviewed Jill Blackstone at the hospital the following day, they were taken aback by her weird attitude and unexpectedly cheerful demeanor. They noticed how she beamed with joy as she bragged about her long, successful career as a television producer in Hollywood. She was smiling, almost giddy, talking about all she had accomplished, even though her youngest sister had just been found dead at her residence. There were no signs of grief or even trauma from what she had allegedly experienced the night before. According to Jill Blackstone, the following sequence of events occurred. Jill Blackstone claimed that the night before the incident, she and her sister Wendy had been hanging out together. They decided to hold a celebration to commemorate Ollie, favorite dog who had died the previous year, which they sometimes did. Jill used the charcoal barbecue to cook them some burgers, but it became really cold outside, so she decided to pull the grill inside the garage. She also lit charcoal inside a metal trash can and pulled it inside. She asked Wendy if she would like to grill some marshmallows, the mint ones she knew she really liked. Wendy, of course, enthusiastically said yes, she'd love them, and Jill left to grab some from the house. Then she suddenly collapsed in the driveway. Jill said she awoke the next morning, face down in her front yard, with the bright sun just blazing down on her neck. She felt disoriented and sick, and she crawled from her front yard to her bedroom, where she phoned her friend and veterinarian, Tracy Reese. She was in a panic on the phone, fearing that she was having a stroke. Tracy then called 911 for her. Jill Blackstone swore to detectives that she would never want to bring her sister any harm, and yet she showed no emotion or grief over Wendy's death or the dog's. Instead, she complained about what a burden Wendy was in her life right after her youngest sister was found dead. Investigators observed how calloused and disrespectful Jill was toward her sister. When asked about her sister's death, she immediately went on the defense. She said to the detectives, "Let me first explain the situation." In her words, this is how she described her sister Wendy to investigators. "Wendy is disabled. She can't do anything without me. She can't drive. She can't go anywhere. She's socially isolated. She can't work." Jill went on to express how the last few years of taking care of her sister had become profoundly worse and had taken its toll. She confessed to them, "Wendy is consuming my life. I was just tired of taking care of her." When asked about the notes placed around the residence, she claimed that in the days before she was struggling emotionally really bad, and she wrote them down in the hopes of finding the courage to end their lives, which she said she, of course, never could have done. Jill Blackstone recognized the bizarre circumstances surrounding her sister's death. She even acknowledged to detectives how she understood how she would be viewed as the prime suspect. Jill stated, and I quote, "I know what it looks like. This was not me. It's just not." But she also said to the police, "Maybe part of me just snapped. I don't know. I don't know what that feels like to snap. I can tell you that I've never snapped before. People think I'm the strongest person in the world." Snapping and waking up in a haze may have been believable if it weren't for the beyond bizarre and suspicious notes left outside the garage and around the house. These illustrated the criminal intent of Jill Blackstone with premeditated intention and her attempt to cover up the murders with an array of random notes and signs to convey that an unbelievable suicide agreement was allegedly made between the sisters. Investigators believe that Jill Blackstone had initially planned to kill herself, but something happened that night that made her change her mind. At the last minute, after she lit the grill and placed ash inside the trash can, she decided to leave the garage, supposedly to get marshmallows, which she closed shut and never returned to Wendy or the dogs. Whether or not the suicide pact was ever legitimate between the sisters doesn't really matter. because when Jill chose to not go through with it and left her and the dogs inside a closed garage to die, she intentionally caused her sister's death and the dogs. She, of course, claimed that she lost consciousness shortly after leaving the garage. Even if this were true, this action does not negate the fact that she left her blind and partially deaf sister and their 3 rescue dogs inside a closed garage with a burning grill and trash can. I don't think Jill Blackstone had any intention of returning, whether she was drunk or drugged herself shortly before passing out on the pavement. Her story just doesn't add up. Upon their initial interview with Jill Blackstone, she stated to investigators that Wendy never talked about ending her life and she was not at all suicidal. The inconsistency of her statements and her negative attitude towards her sister was alarming. She rewrote what had happened that night, painting an image of this nice evening the 2 sisters were sharing, and then a tragic accident occurred. The admission that she had hoped to find the courage to end their lives, and her claims to have not done anything to harm her sister, were in conflict with one another. What Jill Blackstone claimed happened to her sister Wendy and the dogs did not align with the evidence. Investigators informed her that she was going to be arrested for her sister's murder and for animal abuse. As the interview came to an end, she said, I get where you're seeing this from. All I can say is I'm the best person I know. I devoted my life to saving animals and saving people. I'm a good person. I devoted my life to helping Wendy, and I would never want to bring her harm. Investigators pulled Jill Blackstone out of the hospital and placed her into immediate custody. 2 days later, when the case was presented to the district attorney's office, they wanted more evidence before pursuing official charges. The prosecution elected not to file charges against her because they didn't think there was sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. A lot of people, though, media included, speculated that the district attorney was hesitant to arrest a successful Hollywood television producer for murder. Homicide investigators continued to work on gathering information to build and further support their case. Both the LAPD homicide detectives and the arson investigators for the Los Angeles Fire Department performed separate investigations. It was not a clear-cut crime scene. It was a complicated and highly sensitive investigation that included many interviews, research into both their finances, and the processing of forensic evidence. According to one neighbor, Stephanie Cohen, 60, who lived across from the Blackstone residence, the sisters had been looking for a home, but they kept running into obstacles. Being able to find a place that was suitable for Wendy's illness and accept their 3 dogs was very difficult. Mrs. Cohen pointed out to investigators how Wendy was very ill and housebound with her vision and hearing disabilities. She was aware that the sisters had been under mounting stress. To me, this sounds like what Jill Blackstone portrayed to others so that she would garner sympathy for her situation. It was important to her that she was perceived as this caring, generous sister who did everything for her disabled sister Wendy, who was just helpless without her. Homicide detectives traveled to New Jersey to meet with Mr. and Mrs. Blackstone. They were, as expected, in deep grief and disbelief over their daughter Wendy's tragic and sudden death. When asked about their daughter's relationship, they said they were close, that Jill had always looked out for her younger sister, and that there were no problems between them. The parents were protective and defensive of their daughter Jill, and any suspicions around her involvement. They refused to believe that Wendy's death was anything other than a tragic accident. Wendy Blackstone was born on August 2, 1965, in Bayonne, New Jersey. The youngest of 3 sisters, Jill, who was the oldest, Lisa in the middle, and Wendy, who was the baby. In her early teen years during a bar mitzvah, Wendy began to experience vision issues and had extreme discomfort in her eyes. She was later diagnosed with Usher syndrome, which is a rare genetic disorder. It is a degenerative disease that progressively impairs both the person's vision and hearing, and it can also affect balance. What is distinct about this disease over some others is that it does not impact the infected individual's intelligence, nor does it adversely affect their lifespan. Wendy Blackstone didn't allow her condition to define her or limit her life. She attended a private school and then graduated from university. Jill was always by her side, helping her as she could. As Wendy's condition progressively worsened, she could no longer work and began receiving Social Security benefits. Meanwhile, Jill Blackstone had earned a master's in communications. Over the years, Jill became increasingly more in demand. Her career was thriving. She had a huge home in the Hollywood Hills, and she invited Wendy often over to come visit her. Wendy Blackstone was known for being positive even in the hardest of times, and she was not solely dependent upon her older sister Jill, the way she portrayed her to be. Wendy Blackstone's life was not one of despair and hopelessness because she had disabilities. She had friends who loved her, and her work with the Animal Rescue Foundation gave her life meaning and enrichment. Wendy Blackstone was legally blind and used hearing aids, but she wasn't helpless and incapable of taking care of herself. She was not an invalid, and she was not as dependent upon her sister, nor as unhealthy as Jill led others to believe. She was not the heavy burden Jill made her out to be. When investigators talked to Wendy's friends, they strongly disagreed with how Jill had described her sister. Wendy was social and active, and no one believed that Wendy would take her own life. John Winberg, a friend of Wendy's who also suffered from Usher disease, was very upset when he heard Jill describing her sister as this invalid who couldn't do anything without her. According to her friend John, Wendy was completely capable of taking care of herself, and he told investigators that he didn't believe for a second that Wendy had taken her own life. The coroner's report indicated that except for her vision and hearing loss due to Usher syndrome, Wendy Blackstone was in exceptionally great health. Wendy was 48 years old and was in really good physical shape. She was attractive, slender, and ran on the treadmill 45 minutes every day. Wendy Blackstone was muscular and athletic, and there was no evidence of any disease or health issue outside of her disorder. In fact, she was much healthier than her sister Jill was, in every way, who happened to be the sister still alive. Jill Blackstone herself had been suffering from a health condition. She had been diagnosed with lupus, which is a chronic autoimmune disease. It can inflict the individual with fever, joint pain, chest pain, memory loss, heart and lung problems, and mental health involving depression and anxiety. The symptoms of lupus are long and varied, and it can be difficult to identify whether they are symptoms of the disease itself or exist independent of it. When Jill Blackstone was taken into custody and arrested for murder, the Los Angeles Police Department made an official statement to the press. They said that they believed the murder was motivated by Jill's escalated frustration surrounding Wendy's long-term health care and the financial burden associated with it. However, as aforementioned, Wendy Blackstone was not nearly as incapable of taking care of herself as her sister Jill led others to believe, and the financial hardships were mainly due to Jill Blackstone's massive debt. A few years before her tragic death, Wendy Blackstone had been living on her own in New Jersey. Jill Blackstone was once a big name in Hollywood as a television producer, and Wendy frequently visited her in Los Angeles, flying out there on her own. Jill Blackstone worked on some of the biggest shows in reality TV at the time, including Jerry Springer, Divorce Court, and The Tony Danza Show. For younger listeners, these names may not be well known, but for those of us who lived through the 90s, this was a time when reality talk shows and courtroom programs were all the rage, and no name was bigger in TV than the salacious Jerry Springer Show. She even earned a nomination for a Cable Ace Award in 1993. In 2008 and 2009, Jill Blackstone directed over 100 episodes of the popular show Family Court with Judge Penny. At one point in her career, Jill Blackstone was very successful and had garnered great material wealth and financial security. When she was diagnosed with lupus, she was not able to work as much as she used to, and this drastically changed her financial situation. She was faced with a massive amount of debt and had turned to her sister Wendy many times to help her out with her financial difficulties. According to Anthony Fair, someone who had previously worked with Jill, it was Jill, not Wendy, who had initiated moving to Los Angeles to live with her. In 2012, Jill Blackstone had filed for bankruptcy. It was reported by the Daily Mail Online that as of 2015, she was $1.4 million in debt. Wendy Blackstone was the sister who had been financially grounded, not her sister, and Jill took advantage of that. Although Wendy couldn't work, she did receive Social Security benefits, most of which she saved. Wendy frequently helped Jill out with bills, and when Wendy died, Jill was in debt to her sister for $122,000. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office determined that Wendy Blackstone had died of inhalation of combustion fumes and ingestion of the sedative alprazolam, which is also known as Xanax. Xanax is often used to relax an individual and help make them calm, but it also causes impaired coordination, increased feelings of drowsiness, and slows down the person's breathing and heart rate. In other words, Wendy Blackstone was sedated when the grill burst into flames and released toxic smoke into the garage. Wendy's doctor informed the police that she had never been prescribed Xanax. The only person in the household with a prescription for Xanax was Jill Blackstone. Crime scene investigators had also observed a bottle of vodka at the scene, which was mostly empty, but an autopsy showed there was no evidence of alcohol in Wendy Blackstone's system. During a forensic analysis of Wendy Blackstone's computer, detectives discovered a disturbing email. There was evidence that Jill may have tried to kill Wendy weeks before her death. According to this email, Wendy had written to a friend of hers about a cookie Jill had given her one afternoon that tasted off. Jill had cut this cookie in half and gave the other to Wendy. That same night when she went to bed, Wendy was unable to get up, as if she were heavily drugged. The next day, she asked her sister what was in the cookie. Jill made up some strange, unbelievable explanation about how maybe their dog's tramadol, which is a canine narcotic, somehow got into it. It sounded as if Jill Blackstone had conducted a trial run on how the Xanax would affect her sister to determine how much she would need for an overdose. An analysis of Jill Blackstone's computer by the FBI would also reveal evidence of the possible premeditation of her sister's death weeks before she died. Specifically, there were 3 topics in her search history that were unnerving and suspicious to homicide detectives. These included suicide by gun, carbon monoxide, and poisoning. The case was investigated for almost 3 years by law enforcement, but each time homicide detectives would approach the prosecutor with more evidence, they always wanted something more. Then, out of nowhere, on March 9th, 2018, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office finally decided to seek justice. They filed 1 charge of murder and 3 charges of animal cruelty against Jill Blackstone. Finally, a warrant was made for her arrest. Police initially headed to where her parents lived in New Jersey, which they knew, based on her social media accounts, Jill had been visiting. When they arrived, she was no longer there, and her parents said she had left weeks earlier. Jill Blackstone's parents were also no longer willing to cooperate with law enforcement. Jill's attorney ended up contacting homicide investigators on her behalf to inform them that she was in a hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. She had checked herself in due to a medical condition. She was arrested at the hospital by Los Angeles homicide detectives and the Baltimore police. She was immediately taken into custody and held in jail at the Baltimore Police Department before being extradited back to Los Angeles to await her fate. The evidence that the prosecution had collected over these 3 years against Jill Blackstone, although circumstantial, was very strong. The defendant had opportunity, motive. There were several elements of premeditation and signs of an attempted cover-up. Jill Blackstone, if convicted of first-degree murder, was faced with the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. The main challenge the prosecution faced in proving first-degree murder is that there was no evidence as to whether the victim had knowingly participated in the act at some point. However, Wendy Blackstone did not write any of the notes and signs indicating that she had chosen to die, or that she was even aware of her sister's plan to murder her and then commit suicide. All of the notes and signs presented the reasonable belief that Jill Blackstone alone had planned to murder her and then take her own life, but then backed out of the plan. In my opinion, the notes and signs indicated the concealment of the murder by creating an elaborate ruse of a suicide pact that went awry when Jill abruptly left the scene and then lost consciousness from carbon monoxide poisoning. It seems quite convenient for her that she just happened to get up and grab marshmallows from inside the house while her sister and their dogs were slowly suffocating on the toxic air they were forced to breathe in while trapped inside the garage. Now, there is the minute possibility that maybe Jill had initially planned on a murder-suicide and then decided against taking her life. But that does not negate the fact that she left her sister and 3 helpless dogs to die in a closed garage. Unfortunately, like in many other cases, much of the evidence that had been collected and analyzed from the crime scene was destroyed sometime between the initial investigation into Wendy's murder in 2015 and her sister being charged 3 years later. It was not reported whether it was intentionally ruined or was by accident or neglect, but this grossly affected the prosecution's case once they finally decided to file charges of murder against Jill Blackstone. There is little information as to why the district attorney's office waited 3 years to file charges, except that they were supposedly hoping to gather additional evidence regarding the written notes, so that they could prove they were Jill Blackstone's writing alone. Why did they not consult a handwriting expert to compare her writing to the notes? There are areas of the investigation that feel thorough and diligent, and others that appear incomplete and seem illogical, that certain aspects of the crime weren't further pursued to solidify the case. Jill Blackstone's defense attorney, Daniel Davis, insisted to the media that there was no crime, but rather it was a tragic accident that happened while Jill was barbecuing for herself and her sister. He described the evidence of a murder caused by arson as fake evidence, since the garage never burned down and there was never a fire. Although this was technically true, there was still evidence that the grill had been lit and there was burning ash inside the trash can, which led to carbon monoxide poisoning. Initially, a 5-day hearing was held where Jill Blackstone was ordered to stand trial for murder. An officer with the LAPD testified to the discovery of the odd note that was allegedly written by the defendant, left near her dead sister's hand. The defense contended that the state had insufficient evidence to prosecute Jill Blackstone for murder, but the Superior Court judge disagreed. Judge James Brandolino addressed how a reasonable inference could be made from the notes as to the intentions and outcome of the crime. He believed that the evidence showed that Jill Blackstone's intentions were to commit murder and then suicide, but something must have happened, and the taking of her own life didn't go as planned. The nature of the words within the notes Jill had written and the other factors of the crime scene led to strong support of this inference. Jill Blackstone must have realized that the prosecution's case against her was very strong, and if she faced a jury, she would likely be painted as a cold-blooded murderer who killed her disabled sister and sacrificed the lives of 2, almost 3, beautiful rescue dogs. Her defense attorney, Daniel Davis, was quoted as referring to the case as a family tragedy and stated how Jill Blackstone's elderly parents didn't wish to see their daughter live the rest of her days in prison. Although she and her defense counsel claimed that she was innocent of murder, they said that their defendant couldn't afford to take the risk of facing life in prison due to her ailing health. At the time, Jill Blackstone was suffering from both lupus and Parkinson's disease. She was in extremely poor physical health and used a wheelchair in the courtroom. The district attorney's office still had difficulty believing that they could obtain a conviction for first-degree murder, given the evidence and lingering questions around the case. I think that was an excuse. There have been many first-degree murder cases tried and convicted on much less evidence than the state had against Jill Blackstone. I have no doubt that in combination with her once-acclaimed status as a Hollywood television producer, her solid defense representation, her declining health, in addition to the poor health of the victim, all led the prosecution to offer her a plea deal. 3 years after the deplorable and heartless murder of her sister and 2 of their rescue dogs, Jill Blackstone, 59, pled no contest to 1 felony count of voluntary manslaughter and 3 felony counts of animal cruelty. A no contest plea, also known as a nolo contendere plea, is a plea where the defendant accepts punishment for the charge, but does not admit guilt to the crime. It is a method employed in a plea agreement where the defendant does not dispute the charges and chooses not to fight them in court. However, the legal consequences may or may not be any different from pleading guilty to the crime. Jill Blackstone was sentenced to 8 years in prison. She served only 6 years and was released in March 2024. This penalty for her horrific crimes is a joke. I personally find it revolting that this woman spent such little time incarcerated for the brutal murder of her sister and the deaths of 2 living pets. It makes no sense to me that the prosecutors would accept a plea deal that led to such little prison time for someone who killed her sister and 2 dogs. There was more than sufficient evidence that she had committed first-degree premeditated murder. Jill Blackstone was motivated to get rid of her sister so she didn't have to help take care of her. I believe an even stronger motivation to murder her was the over $120,000 she owed her sister Wendy, which, if she were dead, was no longer a concern for Jill. The bizarre, contrived notes and signs she made in an attempt to make it appear as if there had been a suicide pact between the sisters gone wrong was not at all believable. The prosecution had a witness who would have also testified to Jill likely having drugged Wendy only a few weeks before her death. Her sentence, however, did surpass the average length for this degree of homicide. According to the criminal codes under California, an individual who is found guilty of voluntary manslaughter faces anywhere between 3 to 11 years in prison. Voluntary manslaughter is defined as intentional homicide without malice or premeditation. It is not much different than second-degree murder, which is often described as a crime of passion or rage in the moment that leads to a person's death. But the penalty is much more severe, with a minimum sentence of 20 years to life. Second-degree murder is defined as having malice aforethought without premeditation. So simply put, malice is not an element in voluntary manslaughter. I don't find this definition to fit the evidence surrounding Wendy Blackstone's death. The bizarre notes found around the residence clearly indicated that Jill had planned and had intended to murder her sister Wendy through the facade of a suicide pact. There was no evidence that Wendy Blackstone had suicidal ideation at all, much less any evidence indicating that she was involved in this plan for the sisters to take their own lives. As I mentioned earlier, why would they have intended to kill their rescue dogs along with themselves? This key detail in the crime should have been looked at much closer because no one who rescues an animal is going to take their life under the premise that they all want to be together in the afterlife. Not unless there was evidence of a severe mental illness and or psychosis, which at least for Wendy Blackstone, there was no sign. Jill Blackstone, though, I think is a psychotic narcissist who believes she could get away with killing her sister and their dogs by making people believe that her sister was so debilitated that she no longer wanted to live. From the view of criminology, this case is important to discuss through 2 different lenses. First, the type of homicide it was, and second, who the victim was. It is normal for sisters to argue, compete with, tease one another, but it is hard to deny that for most, they share a special unbreakable bond. Physical violence between sisters is very uncommon, and murder is almost unheard of. Amongst all sibling-based killings, sororicide, which is the killing of a sister, rarely occurs. A sister killing another sister is by far the most rare of kind. I have discussed this topic before in my Thanksgiving episode, Recipe for Murder, so I won't go into too much detail. Research on siblicide is minimal, but studies show that this type of homicide mainly occurs between adults, with some studies showing as high as 78% of this type of murder are committed by individuals older than 18. The majority of these cases happen while the siblings are still living with each other. The victims also tend to be the younger siblings. A multinational study across 75 countries identified that the largest year range of victims' ages were between 20 and 29 and 30 to 59, each representing 43% of all cases. Jill and Wendy Blackstone matched all of these characteristics. Wendy was 49 and Jill was 55 at the time of the murder, and they lived in the same home. The second and even more relevant discussion of this case is the murder of a disabled victim and how the value of her life may have impacted the outcome and thus the lack of justice Wendy Blackstone received. It is estimated based on reports by the CDC that 1 in 4 adults in the United States, which is roughly 70 million people, have a disability. Individuals with disabilities, whether they are mobility related, vision, hearing, cognitive, or a combination of impairment, are 3 times more likely to be victims of violence than people who are non-disabled. Like many other victims of violence, especially in marginalized populations, the number of people with disabilities who are being abused is grossly underreported. This is due to many reasons, including fear of retribution from their abuser, concern they won't be believed, and the overall lack of support they are given by the criminal justice system. A 2012 report conducted by the National Survey on Abuse of People with Disabilities revealed that for victims who report their abuse, nothing happened in more than half of all cases, and the alleged offenders were arrested in less than 10%. Statistics show that individuals with physical and mental disabilities are disproportionately at risk for becoming victims of violence, including physical and emotional abuse, sexual assault, neglect, robbery, and homicide. In cases of homicide, the perpetrators are overwhelmingly someone the victim knows. More often than not, the offenders are their caregivers, including both family members and non-family members. The people to whom they trust their physical and emotional well-being to are those they should fear the most. Between 2011 and 2015, 219 disabled individuals were murdered by their parents or other caregivers. That is an average of 1 disabled person being killed every week. These murders are often motivated by what the killer claims to be a hardship, as if that can justify their crime. The victim is too often ignored by the media, and instead the focus is placed on the killer and what they have endured. The intimate association of being disabled with suffering results in a lack of justice. Many perpetrators who kill disabled victims receive very little to no prison time at all, because this narrative impacts the court. A study done on the harmful portrayal of disabled victims of homicide in the media revealed that the victims themselves are rarely the focus of the case. They are often designated as objects of care and suffering that were causing the perpetrator such extreme levels of stress that they became overwhelmed and snapped. Instead of being represented as the individuals who were victims of violence, they are defined by what the family member or caretaker was doing for them. The perpetrator's experience and struggle through the circumstances of taking care of the disabled person becomes the priority. The disabled victim is portrayed as being this heavy burden to their caretaker, which caused their tragic death. This leads many of these cases of homicide to be perceived as mercy killings, when they in fact are not. The media, society, and the courts tend to hold some level of sympathy for the offender's situation, and buy into the concept of the killing being motivated by love or because they were overwhelmed by the stress of caring for them. This culminates in a lack of sympathy for the victim, compassion for the perpetrator, and often results in a lack of justice. This discrimination and unjustified bias towards the perspective and experience of the offender over the victim is rooted in 3 myths around those who are disabled. The first is that people with disabilities are all suffering. The second is that an individual with a disability can't make choices for themselves, nor do they know what is best for them. Even people with severe cognitive impairments can make choices in what they want to do in their lives. The third myth centers around how many individuals in society avoid dealing with victims of crime at all. It is easier for them to act as if these people don't exist or they must be partially to blame. For disabled victims of crime, these prejudices are much worse with the criminal justice system, not even knowing how best to handle them, so they just don't. Victims' rights for the disabled have only in recent years become an area of discussion and focus in the criminal justice system, and hopefully continue to make progress so disabled victims receive more justice. Wendy Blackstone and her 2 dogs were senselessly taken from this world and were not given the justice they deserved. Jill Blackstone was not in the least sorry for killing them. She never once expressed remorse, regret, or even grief. She never talked about the loss of her sister as if it mattered to her at all. It was as if she believed the elaborate lies she had spun to the police, the court, and the press. She had bought into the notion that it was a tragic accident, although it was obvious that what unfolded was the outcome she had hoped and planned for. I don't believe for 1 second that Jill Blackstone didn't intentionally cause her sister's death. It disgusts me that the value of Jill Blackstone's life was taken under more consideration by the court than her murdered sister and her dogs were. That she is free is appalling to me. The only semblance of justice is that I know Jill Blackstone is suffering miserably from her debilitating health issues. And I guess in this case, that is the best form of justice we can hope for. What are your thoughts on this bizarre case? Do you think Jill Blackstone had initially planned a murder-suicide but then decided to not kill herself? Or was Jill Blackstone just an evil woman who thought she was smarter than everyone and used her tools as a Hollywood producer to craft the concealment of the premeditated murder of her sister? Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'm beyond thrilled to bring you stories. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening on the streets, next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music, Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.